Hey guys, it's Alex from Buttercup Woodworks. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this herringbone table with hairpin legs. Stay tuned. Hey, what's up guys? So like with any build, what I'm doing first is breaking all of them down to their final length. This coffee table is going to measure 48 inches by 30 inches. So what I'm doing here is breaking down all the angle irons to their final length. So the height for this coffee table is 20 inches tall. What I'm doing is measuring out the steel bars to 42 inches long and then taking it to my steel bender. So after taking the steel rod to my bender, I'm usually left with a leg in the length of 20 inches. The final height for this leg needs to be 19 inches. After marking them at that measurement, I'll take them to my chop saw and then cut off the excess. So here's a trick that I picked up from John Malecki. Instead of doing miters on this build, what I do is I just cut out a notch and then weld the adjoining piece on there, making a 90-degree angle. So before any welding's done, I take every piece to the grinder and make a bevel on it. This ensures that when I weld it, it'll be a nice strong joint. After tacking all 4 pieces, I check and I double check to make sure everything's in square before I weld the pieces together. Instead of welding the hairpin legs to a base plate, I weld them directly onto the steel frame. I'm just measuring 3 inches in from each one and I tack them into place. So once the tacks for the table legs are completed, I'll come back and I'll usually weld everything in 2 passes just to ensure that it's a strong bond. Once I complete all the welding, I'll come back with a grinder and make sure that everything is smooth to the touch. So after marking the locations where the screws are going to go underneath, I use titanium bits and lubricant so that I don't burn them out. After completing all the holes, I'll come back with some sandpaper and make sure it's smooth to the touch and getting it ready for paint. So after wiping down the table with mineral spirits, I'll do about 2 coats of primer and then about 5 thin coats of flat black enamel. For the tabletop, using a featherboard and my fence, I removed the rounded edges of all the 2x. Once the rounded edges are removed, I take them back to my table saw and resaw them into 3/8 of an inch strips. Once all the resawing is complete, I'll take them down to my table saw and rip them all to the same width. This next step is completely optional, but I personally like to run them through the planer to make sure that they're all the same thickness, making it easier later when it comes to sanding. Once all the pieces are uniformed in thickness, I bring them to my crosscut sled and cut them all to the same length. Using my circular saw, I cut down the piece of plywood into a more manageable piece. So here's where the fun begins. Using a brad nailer, a square, some wood glue, and the pieces of wood, I start marking out the pattern for the herringbone tabletop. So a lot of people say that they spread the glue to make sure that you get even coverage. I've actually learned that when you press the piece firmly down, it spreads itself. And I've never had an issue with this. So I just make sure here that I push the wood firmly down onto the plywood and against the other pieces to ensure it tight bond, and then just put 4 brad nails on each. After letting the glue dry overnight, I'll use a jigsaw to remove all the excess material. Then using a flush trim bit on my router, I'll run it against the factory edge to make sure that I have a nice straight line. Using the factory edge, I'll rip it down to its final width, and then using my crosscut sled, I'll cut it to its final length. When sanding any projects, I'll usually start with an 80 grit and then work my way up to 220 grit. Afterwards, I'll run it with a damp rag and then sand it a little bit more to make sure that I get a nice smooth surface. So for the color, I chose Early American by Varathane. It's one of my favorite colors to use, especially when I use steel and wood in any project. The great thing about this product is it's incredibly easy to use. After several minutes, you just wipe it off, leaving you with a beautiful tabletop. Then afterwards, I'll usually do about 4 coats of semi-gloss polyurethane. And after letting it dry for a couple days, I call this project done. This was a super fun project, and I love the simplicity of it. The steel frame makes the herringbone pattern pop, and that's what I love about it. If you guys enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave any comments. They're greatly appreciated. Thanks, guys.